In Houston, Texas, a young couple lived quietly, tucked away in their apartment. Tatyana Evans, 23, and Geovanni Montague, 28, had been together for a while. To the outside world they seemed like any other couple, working, talking about their future, and navigating the challenges of a relationship. Yet beneath that surface, cracks had begun to show. Not loud, not obvious, just the quiet kind of tension that settles over time when something's off. It had started subtly. Geovanni had always been an army veteran with a calm demeanor, but recently Tatyana began noticing things she hadn't before. A phone call that lasted too long, a message he wouldn't show her, a name on the screen she didn't recognize. There were moments, fleeting ones, when she could sense something was wrong, but she couldn't quite pinpoint it. In the evenings they would sit together on the couch, but Tatyana noticed how his attention drifted. His eyes flicked away when she spoke, his answers a little too quick, as if he were already thinking about something else. And then there were the texts. One evening she picked up his phone. It had always been a point of trust between them. But this time, her hand hovered over the screen as she saw a message pop up from another woman. The words seemed harmless at first, casual even. But something about them felt off. The familiarity, the tone, it didn't sit right. Tatyana wasn't someone to jump to conclusions. She never had been. But what she saw gnawed at her. And she couldn't ignore the feeling of betrayal creeping in. The phone had become a doorway, one she wasn't sure she wanted to walk through. But the curiosity, the suspicion, pulled at her. The next moments would decide everything. As she sat there, staring at the phone, something in her snapped. A familiar voice in her head urged her to confront him. It was time to face the truth, whatever it was. But the question remained, could she handle the truth? Tension builds in the voiceover, quiet but intense. What she was about to discover would tear their world apart. The truth was closer than she thought, and with it, the pieces of their relationship would fall into place in the most shocking way possible. What would she do when she saw everything laid bare in front of her? What would happen when the truth, as painful as it was, finally broke through? There are moments in life that shift everything. You don't see them coming. You don't recognize them until it's too late. That evening in Houston was one of those moments. Tatyana Evans had always trusted Geovanni Montague. Their relationship had been on and off, but it had never felt dangerous, never felt as though it could snap at any given moment. She had built her life around him, her future intertwined with his. But trust, as she would learn that night, can be a fragile thing. The evening had been quiet. Tatyana moved through their small apartment, her mind replaying the recent conversations with Geovanni, who had become more distant over the past few weeks. It wasn't like him. Or at least she didn't think it was. Something had changed. Something in his eyes, in his voice. But she had no evidence, no proof, just a creeping sense of unease that gnawed at her. She entered the kitchen, the dim light casting long shadows against the walls. Geovanni's phone sat on the counter, face down. Something about it felt wrong. It was too still, too quiet, as if it were waiting for her to make the move. And she did. Her fingers lingered over it for just a moment, hesitant, unsure. But the doubt she'd been carrying in her chest now made its way to her fingertips. She was already too deep in this, drawn toward the phone as if it held the answers to a question she hadn't even fully asked. Without thinking, she picked it up. The cold weight of the phone in her palm sent a shiver through her spine. It was too familiar. She had seen this before, Geovanni's phone, always resting on the counter, never hidden. But tonight felt different. The screen lit up in an instant. Her thumb hovered over it, unwilling to scroll, yet unable to look away. The messages flashed before her eyes. At first they were just words. Casual. Playful. But as the seconds ticked by, a knot began to form in her stomach. The messages weren't for her. They weren't meant for her eyes. A woman. A name she didn't recognize. And the tone was unmistakable. Too friendly. Too intimate. Words that shouldn't have belonged in their world. Not in hers. Each message hit her like a punch. She tried to breathe, tried to reason with herself. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it was harmless. But deep down she knew. This wasn't harmless. This wasn't nothing. Her heart pounded in her chest, and 1,000 questions flooded her mind. Who was this woman? How long had this been going on? Why didn't he tell me? She stood there, motionless, her fingers tightening around the phone. The room felt too small. The walls were closing in on her, each breath becoming harder to take. The words on the screen blurred as anger replaced disbelief. She had trusted him. She had believed in him. But this was betrayal. And it cut deeper than anything she had ever imagined. The silence in the room was suffocating. She could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic outside, but it was as if the world had paused. Everything in her body told her to confront him, to expose the lie, to ask him, to demand answers. And yet, in the pit of her stomach, she hesitated. What would happen if she confronted him? What if this shattered everything? Her mind raced, but her body was still. She felt herself caught in a moment of absolute clarity and chaos, unable to move, frozen between knowing and not knowing. In that instant, it wasn't just about the phone or the woman on the other side of the screen. It was about everything she thought she knew about Geovanni, about their relationship, about herself. Her hand trembled as she raised the phone, staring at it like it held the key to a world she didn't want to unlock. What would Tatyana do now that the truth was in her hands? Would she confront the man she thought she knew, or would she let it go, pretend she hadn't seen what she had just discovered? Could she walk away from the phone, from the messages, and from the truth they held? But nothing could prepare her for what would happen next. Because the moment she decided to face Geovanni would be the moment her world shattered, forever. There are moments when anger becomes something else. Something deeper. Something that swallows everything in its path. Tatyana Evans had always been calm, controlled. She'd held onto her patience, her trust in Geovanni. But when that trust shattered, when the truth came pouring out, piece by painful piece, the weight of it was too much to carry. She wasn't just hurt. She wasn't just betrayed. She was consumed. By the time that night fell over Houston, Tatyana was a different person. The air in their apartment seemed thicker, heavy with the tension that had been building for days. She couldn't escape the flood of emotions. Betrayal, rage, disbelief. Each one crashing against the next like waves, threatening to drown her. Geovanni had no idea. He couldn't see it, couldn't feel the storm inside her. She had tried to keep it in, tried to push down the burning anger, but it was futile. His words, his excuses, his lies had only fanned the flames. She stood across from him, the distance between them now felt vast, despite them being in the same room. He was speaking, but she wasn't listening. The words coming out of his mouth were a blur. All she could hear now was the pounding of her own heart in her ears, the steady rhythm that had only one meaning. Something was going to happen. Something was already happening. Her hand, trembling, gripped the strap of her bag. Her mind raced, replaying everything she had seen. Those text messages, the way his gaze shifted when he spoke to her. The trust she had given him had been nothing more than a thread, fragile and easy to snap. Her fingers brushed the cool surface of the gun hidden in her bag. She hadn't meant for it to go this far. She hadn't meant for it to end like this. But now, with every word from Geovanni, the anger built again. She could feel it, pulsing beneath her skin like fire, hot and consuming. She wanted to scream. She wanted to make him feel what she felt. She wanted him to understand, truly understand, the devastation he had caused. Her eyes darted to the bag, to the weight inside. The gun. The final piece of this equation. The final choice. It had always been there, hidden beneath the surface. Something she'd kept just out of reach, something she had never imagined she would need. But now it was all she could think about. It was the only answer that felt real. The only solution to the chaos she couldn't control. The camera moves in closer, capturing the intensity in her eyes now clouded with something darker. Her pupils dilate as her breath quickens, her hands slowly inching toward the bag. The sound of her heartbeat is almost deafening now, a rhythmic thumping that matches the pounding in her chest. She pulls the bag open. Her fingers graze the cold metal of the gun. There's no turning back. The sound of the gun being lifted, the quiet click of the safety being undone, fills the room. It's final. In that instant the room grows still. Time seems to stretch out, each second dragging, stretching the air thinner. Her hands shake as she holds the gun, her fingers wrapped around the handle, uncertain but resolute. Geovanni's voice falters as he looks at her, confusion in his eyes, unaware of the storm he's standing in. Tatyana's breathing slows, her focus narrowing. She lifts the gun slowly, pointing it at him. Everything about the world seems to freeze. The sound of her heartbeat is the only thing left. What was once a moment of anger was now something far worse. Something irreversible. Her finger hovers over the trigger. There is no coming back from this. No apologies. No explanations. Just a choice. A choice that would change everything. And in that moment, Tatyana would decide whether to pull the trigger, or let the world shatter around her. It happened in a second. A single moment that could never be undone. The sound tore through the room, sharp, deafening, final. It didn't just cut through the air. It cut through time itself. The bullet moved faster than thought, faster than regret. One pull of the trigger and everything changed. The The world fell silent. For a moment there was nothing. No movement. No sound. Just the echo of the gunshot bouncing off the walls, sinking into the floor, dissolving into the very fabric of the room. Then Geovanni staggered. His eyes, wide, disbelieving, searched the space between them as if trying to understand what had just happened. He opened his mouth but no words came. Just a sharp, shallow breath. His body, once strong, now gave way beneath him. He collapsed. The thud of his body against the floor wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, almost insignificant. But in that moment, it was the loudest sound Tatyana had ever heard. For a moment, the world ceases to exist. Then a single sound breaks through, Tatyana's breath, shaky and uneven, coming in short gasps. The gun is still in her hand, her fingers locked around the grip, the weight of it suddenly unbearable. She can feel the cold metal pressing against her palm, but she can't move. Her mind races, replaying what just happened. The way his body jerked. The way his face changed in that last second. Confusion, pain, then nothing. She never imagined it would feel like this. She thought there would be relief. She thought the anger would disappear. But there's nothing. No satisfaction. No justice. Only silence. Her ears are ringing, the sharp, high-pitched hum filling the empty space where Geovanni's voice used to be. And then it hits her. Her breathing turns into shallow, panicked gasps. Her hands tremble. The gun slips from her grasp, landing next to his body with a soft metallic clatter. The same gun she had held with certainty just moments ago now felt foreign, like it had never belonged to her. Her eyes dart around the room. The walls are the same. The furniture hasn't moved. Nothing about the world has changed. And yet everything is different. Geovanni is gone. And there is no taking it back. The weight of the moment crashes down on her, pressing against her chest, suffocating her. The air feels thick, heavy. She can't stay here. She can't look at him. Her feet move before her mind catches up. She stumbles backward, her heel hitting the edge of a chair. She grips the doorway for balance. The room is spinning. Her pulse pounds in her ears. She needs to leave. No. Her heart slams against her ribs as she rushes toward the door. Her hands are slick with sweat as she grabs the handle. She pulls it open, stepping into the night, into the darkness, into the unknown. She doesn't know where she's going. She doesn't have a plan. All she knows is that she can't be here. She runs. The apartment, the body, the life she just destroyed, it all fades behind her. But the question lingers, following her into the night, whispering in her ear with every step she takes. She just escape a nightmare? Or did she create one? And as the city swallows her whole, one truth remains: there is no escaping what happens next. A call comes in. A voice on the other end, calm, professional, delivers the words with practiced detachment. Possible gunshot victim. Apartment complex. Male unresponsive. Within minutes, red and blue lights flood the darkened streets, cutting through the quiet of the night. Tires screech. Car doors slam. Shadows move swiftly against the brick walls as officers step out, hands resting on their holsters. This is routine for them. Another call, another scene. But as they step inside, something shifts. The first officer to enter stops just past the threshold. His hand tightens around his flashlight. The beam cuts through the dim apartment, landing on a motionless figure sprawled on the floor. Geovanni Montague. He isn't moving. He isn't breathing. One officer kneels beside the body, pressing 2 fingers against his neck. A long pause. Then a glance up. A slight shake of the head. No pulse. The room is eerily still. A faint smell of gunpowder lingers in the air, mixing with something else, something metallic. Blood pools beneath Geovanni's body, dark and glistening. And yet, there is no sign of struggle. No overturned furniture. No shattered glass. Just one gun. One body. One silence that refuses to break. The officers exchange looks. This isn't a robbery. This isn't random. This is personal. One of them pulls out a notepad, his voice low as he asks the question they've asked 100 times before. Who called it in? A neighbor. They heard a loud bang followed by nothing. No voices. No movement. Just silence. Another officer moves toward the kitchen counter, where a single phone sits, face down. The screen is cracked. It vibrates once, an unread message. No one touches it. Not yet. Not until the detectives arrive. Outside, the flashing lights reflect off the pavement as a black unmarked sedan pulls up. 2 men step out, seasoned detectives, their expressions unreadable. They've seen scenes like this before, but something about this one feels different. One of them steps inside, scanning the apartment, eyes moving over every detail. The phone, the gun, the blood, and then something else. A security camera, small, barely noticeable, blinking silently from the hallway corner. A look passes between the detectives. If the camera was recording, then whoever did this might already be caught. One detective steps outside, radioing for the footage. The other lingers near the door, his gaze shifting back to the lifeless body on the floor. Whoever pulled the trigger wanted to leave no doubt. But they left something behind. A name. A face. A trail. The next move is already set in motion. Tatyana Evans grips the steering wheel, her hands slick with sweat. Her heart pounds as she glances in the rearview mirror. Every pair of headlights feels like a threat. Every turn feels like a dead end. She doesn't know where she's going. She just knows she can't stop. What she doesn't know is that they're already looking for her. And they're getting closer. With every passing mile, with every passing second, the space between her and the truth is closing in. Faster than she thinks. The walls are bare. The light overhead hums softly, casting a pale glow over the small, windowless room. A single metal table sits between them, cold, unyielding. It has seen countless stories unfold, but tonight, it waits for just one. Tatyana Evans. She sits with her arms crossed, her back pressed firmly against the chair. Her face is blank, her expression unreadable. She has been here for hours. And for hours she has said nothing. The detectives have seen this before. The silence, the stillness, it's all part of the act. The refusal to acknowledge what has already been proven. One of them leans forward. His voice is calm, controlled. You were there, Tatyana. No response. He slides a single photograph across the table. A still frame from a security camera. The grainy image shows the outline of a car, parked just outside Geovanni Montague's apartment. The timestamp on the footage leaves no room for doubt. She was there. Tatyana's fingers tighten slightly around her arms, but she doesn't look at the photo. Another detective speaks, his tone firmer. We know you pulled the trigger. Nothing. The room is silent, but the tension is thick, pressing in from every side. Tatyana shifts in her seat. The detectives notice. They know the silence won't last forever. And then one of them plays the final card. They push another photograph toward her, this one different. It isn't grainy. It isn't distant. It's Geovanni. Lying motionless. Eyes closed. Blood pooling beneath him. The air in the room shifts. Tatyana's breathing changes just slightly. The smallest hesitation, the tiniest crack. The first sign that the weight of it all is starting to settle in. The detective speaks again, quieter this time. You loved him, didn't you? Tatyana's jaw clenches. A flicker of something, grief, anger, regret, flashes across her face. And then she exhales. A long, shaky breath. When she finally speaks, her voice is barely above a whisper. You lied to me. The words hang in the air, fragile but heavy. She looks up for the first time, meeting their eyes. The mask she's been wearing all night starts to slip. She swallows hard. Her fingers twitch against the table. I didn't mean to. She stops herself. The detectives wait. They don't rush her. They know the moment is fragile, that pushing too hard might send her retreating back into silence. Tatyana shakes her head. Her hands press against her face, and when she speaks again, her voice cracks. He was cheating. I saw the messages. I saw everything. Pause. I lost control. The confession comes in pieces, disjointed, scattered. A story told through gasps of air and shaking hands. She describes the gun. How it felt in her palm. How her fingers trembled as she lifted it. She describes his face. The shock. The disbelief. The last look in his eyes before everything went silent. The detectives let her speak, let the truth unravel at its own pace. But even as she confesses, even as the words spill out, there's something missing. A question left unanswered. A detail left unsaid. They watch her carefully. Because now they have to wonder. Was this really just a moment of rage? Or is there something she isn't telling them? Because in the quiet of that interrogation room, beneath the tears and the trembling voice, there is one truth still waiting to be uncovered. And they are about to find it. The room is silent. Not the kind of silence that brings peace, but the kind that suffocates. The kind that grips the air, thick and unrelenting. A gavel strikes. Once. Twice. A single voice cuts through the tension. All rise. Chairs scrape against the floor as the crowd stands. The weight of 100 stares presses down on the woman at the center of it all. Tatyana Evans. She doesn't move right away. She doesn't look up. But when she does, her eyes sweep across the courtroom. The walls seem to close in around her. Rows of strangers. Some whispering, others just watching, waiting for the moment that will decide the rest of her life. The judge takes his seat. The jury is already in place. The prosecution sits poised, a stack of papers neatly arranged in front of them. The defense sits opposite, their expressions unreadable. Tatyana swallows hard. Her hands tighten into fists beneath the table. She knows what they see. A murderer. A woman who pulled the trigger in a fit of rage, who left a man bleeding on the floor. But is that all she is? The courtroom hums with tension as the trial begins. The prosecution wastes no time. This was not an accident. This was not a mistake. Their voice is firm, steady, unwavering. This was an act of jealousy. An act of control. And it ended in a man's death. The jury watches closely. Some nod. Others simply listen. The defense shifts in their seats. They were expecting this. They are ready. When it's their turn, they take a different approach. Love is complicated. Relationships are complicated. What happens when emotion takes over? When heartbreak clouds judgment? They turn toward the jury. She was hurt. She was pushed to the edge. But does that make her a monster? Eyes shift toward Tatyana. The weight of those words settles in her chest. Does it? The prosecution calls their first witness. A forensic expert. They describe the trajectory of the bullet. The distance between shooter and victim. The angle. The force. Clinical. Undeniable. Next, the neighbor who heard the gunshot. They recall the sound, sharp and unmistakable. The silence that followed. And then the footage. The grainy security camera footage of a car parked outside. The timestamp. The door opening, closing. A shadow moving inside. There is no doubt. She was there. But when the defense takes the floor, they push back. What about the messages? The betrayal? The emotional turmoil? Is this a woman who planned a murder? Or someone who simply lost control? A moment of passion. A mistake. A single second that changed everything. Tatyana sits motionless as the voices battle around her. Her past is dissected, her relationship laid bare. Every argument, every text message, every whispered suspicion, all turned into evidence. The jury watches. The judge listens. Outside the courthouse, cameras flash. Reporters stand in clusters, speaking into microphones. The trial of Tatyana Evans has gripped the nation. Was this a crime of passion, or something much colder? The public is divided. Some see a woman pushed past her limit. Others see a killer who knew exactly what she was doing. And through it all, Tatyana sits at the defendant's table, staring at the empty seat where Geovanni should have been. The weight of it all settles on her shoulders. What will they decide? What happens next? The answer will come soon. But not yet. Because before the verdict is read, before the courtroom holds its breath in anticipation, there is one last moment that no one saw coming. And when it happens, nothing will ever be the same again. There are moments in life that define everything that comes after. Moments that cannot be undone, no matter how much regret follows. This is one of those moments. The courtroom is silent, but the weight of what has just happened fills every inch of the space. Tatyana Evans stands motionless as the judge reads the verdict. Words are spoken, final, irreversible. Guilty. A single word that changes everything. She doesn't react at first. Not outwardly. No sudden gasps, no collapse into tears. Just an empty stare, fixed on some distant point in the room. As if she's not really there anymore. As if she left the moment she pulled the trigger. The judge continues, voice firm, unshaken. The sentence is handed down. Years, decades, behind bars. The gavel strikes. It is over. But for the people in this room, for the people who loved Geovanni Montague, it will never really be over. The camera shifts. Geovanni's mother sits in the front row. Her hands are clasped together, knuckles white, as if she's holding herself together by sheer force of will. Beside her, his younger sister wipes away silent tears. A brother lost. A future stolen. A friend in the back row shakes his head, staring at the floor. The memories of Geovanni still fresh, still alive in his mind. The laughter, the late-night talks, the plans for a future that will never come. A life lost. And another life forever changed. Tatyana is led from the courtroom in handcuffs. Her footsteps are slow, deliberate. The weight of her sentence presses down with every step. Outside, reporters swarm the courthouse steps, cameras flashing, voices overlapping. A tragic end to a heartbreaking case. The sentencing of Tatyana Evans closes one chapter, but for Geovanni's family, the pain continues. The headlines will fade. The cameras will move on. But for the people left behind, the loss will remain. Because this is what happens when emotions go unchecked. A single moment. A single decision. And now there is no going back. But as Tatyana disappears through the doors, as Geovanni's family takes their first steps into a world without him, one question lingers. One question no one can seem to answer. Could this have been prevented? And if so, where did it all go wrong? The story should be over. The sentence has been given. The verdict has been decided. But just when it seems like the case is finally closed, something unexpected happens. And suddenly the truth doesn't seem so simple anymore. Some stories don't have a happy ending. Some questions never find an answer. A life was taken. A sentence was handed down. And yet there is no closure. A small gathering stands in the fading light, the air thick with unspoken grief. Candles flicker along the sidewalk, their soft glow casting shadows on the framed photo at the center of it all. Geovanni Montague, frozen in time, smiling, unaware that this would be how he is remembered. A mother places her hand on the picture. The weight of loss presses into her shoulders, but she doesn't speak. She's already said everything she could. Screamed into the silence. Begged for time to reverse itself. None of it mattered. Nothing ever does when it's already too late. A few feet away, Geovanni's sister stands motionless, staring at the memorial, as if willing herself to wake up from a nightmare that never ends. A friend kneels to place a single rose beside the candles, his jaw clenched, his face unreadable. This isn't how things were supposed to be. Tatyana Evans sits in a prison cell, the walls closing in. She had everything once, a future, choices, freedom. Now all she has is time. Time to think. Time to replay that moment over and over, the moment where a single decision erased everything. Outside the prison, life moves on. The world keeps spinning. People wake up, go to work, laugh with friends, make plans. But for two families, nothing moves forward. One mourns a son who will never come home. The other mourns a daughter who will never be free again. Because when love turns to violence, there is no going back. Jealousy didn't just take a life that night. It took a future. It took a family. It took a trust that can never be rebuilt. But as the candles flicker in the night, as faces blur in the darkness, as time marches forward, one question still lingers. One that no one dares to answer. Was this ever really about love at all?